My grandparents meant everything to me growing up. Unlike my parents, who clearly favored my sister Stephanie, my grandparents always made me feel valued. They built a successful business empire and hinted that I would inherit a substantial portion someday. When they passed away, we all gathered at their attorney's office for the will reading. I watched my parents exchange, knowing smiles with Stephanie across the table, completely confident in their plan to redirect my inheritance to her. But none of us were prepared for what happened next. Before I tell you how my grandparents outsmarted my parents from beyond the grave, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button to support more stories of family justice served. Growing up, I had an incredibly special bond with my maternal grandparents, Warren and Eleanor Brooks. They had built a thriving real estate development company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that dominated our city skyline. While my parents lived comfortably in a modest suburban home on their salaries as a bank manager and school administrator, my grandparents resided in a stunning lakeside mansion that seemed magical to me as a child. From my earliest memories, I recall spending weekends at their home, while Stephanie, 3 years younger than me, typically stayed behind with our parents. My grandparents taught me to fish on their private dock, let me help in the workshop where Grandpa Warren built intricate wooden boats as a hobby, and allowed me to sit quietly in Grandma Eleanor's home office as she handled business calls with the confidence and authority that earned her respect across the industry. Alonzo has a mind for business. My grandfather would tell anyone who would listen, just like his grandmother and me. My parents always dismissed these comments with tight smiles. "They are just being nice to you," my mother would say after such gatherings. "Don't let it go to your head." By the time I was 13, the family dynamic was unmistakable. My sister Stephanie was the golden child in my parents' eyes. They attended every one of her dance recitals with elaborate bouquets, framed her mediocre report cards, and spoke endlessly of her potential. Meanwhile, my academic achievements and interest in business were treated as curiosities at best, annoyances at worst. "Focus on something practical," my father would say whenever I talked about following in my grandparents' footsteps. That business was lightning in a bottle. You cannot expect the same success. But my grandparents saw something different in me. When I turned 16, Grandpa Warren started taking me to actual project sites, introducing me to contractors and architects. Grandma Eleanor taught me about property valuation and market analysis over lengthy Sunday brunches. Stephanie was always invited to these sessions, but inevitably declined, preferring to spend time with our parents, who reinforced her disinterest. "That boring business stuff is not for everyone, sweetheart." Despite my parents' discouragement, I applied to business school after high school, specifically targeting programs with strong real estate concentrations. When my acceptance letter arrived with only a partial scholarship, my parents refused to help with the remaining tuition. "We are saving for Stephanie's law school," they explained. "She has her heart set on constitutional law. That is a reliable career path." What they did not know was that my grandparents had already quietly arranged to cover all my educational expenses. They set up a separate account that funded not only my tuition, but also provided a modest living stipend and money for professional attire and networking events. "Your education is an investment," Grandma Eleanor told me over lunch when she handed me the bank card. "All we ask is that you maintain your grades and learn everything you can." College transformed me from an uncertain teenager into a focused young professional. I graduated near the top of my class with internship experience at 2 respected firms, thanks to introductions from my grandparents. When I landed my first job at a boutique commercial real estate company, my grandparents took me out for an extravagant celebration dinner. My parents and Stephanie attended only after significant pressure from Grandma Eleanor. Throughout the evening, they redirected conversations about my achievement to Stephanie's law school applications. "Top schools are very competitive these days," my mother announced to the table. But Stephanie has always been exceptional at standardized tests. My first years in the industry were challenging but exhilarating. I started at the bottom, despite my education working long hours and absorbing everything I could. My grandparents became my mentors, available whenever I called with questions or needed advice on navigating office politics or complex deals. My first significant commission came after 9 months, when I helped secure a tenant for a difficult-to-lease industrial property. The check was not large by industry standards, but it represented a breakthrough moment for me. When I shared the news with my family at a Sunday dinner, my father immediately asked if I was finally making enough to repay my grandparents for school. "There is nothing to repay," my grandmother interjected sharply. "That was our gift to Alonzo because we believe in him." Meanwhile, Stephanie had been accepted to law school with substantial financial support from our parents. They emptied savings accounts and even took out a second mortgage to ensure she had a luxury apartment and did not need to work during her studies. One crisp autumn evening during my 3rd year in the business, my grandparents invited me for a private dinner at their home. After an excellent meal prepared by their longtime housekeeper, Martha Grandpa Warren poured 3 glasses of his prized 30-year scotch and led us to his study. "Alonzo," he said, once we were seated by the fireplace, "your grandmother and I have been watching you build your career with tremendous pride." Grandma Eleanor nodded, her eyes warm with affection. "You remind us so much of ourselves when we started out. The same drive, the same integrity. We want to talk to you about our legacy," Grandpa Warren continued. "As you know, we have built something substantial over our lifetime." They proceeded to explain in broad terms their intention that I would inherit not just financial assets, but also controlling interest in the family company. They described special provisions they had made in their estate planning that would ensure I had the resources and authority to continue their legacy. "We have not shared these specifics with your parents or sister," Grandma Eleanor added carefully. "They have different values when it comes to business and wealth." This conversation marked a turning point in family dynamics. Though I never discussed the inheritance with anyone, something in my parents' behavior suggested they suspected something. Holiday gatherings became increasingly tense, with my mother finding ways to emphasize how much more attention Stephanie deserved from my grandparents. "She is under so much pressure at law school," my mother would announce. "She barely sleeps, trying to make law review. Warren Eleanor, you should really call her more often." Thanksgiving that year culminated in a tense exchange when my father directly questioned why my grandparents spent so much time coaching Alonzo but never offered similar mentorship to Stephanie. "We have always invited Stephanie to participate," my grandfather responded evenly. "The invitation remains open. That is not her passion," my father shot back. Parents and grandparents should support the individual interests of each child equally. As we ate pumpkin pie in uncomfortable silence, I caught Stephanie smirking slightly. That night I overheard her and my mother in the kitchen. "Do not worry," my mother whispered. "When the time comes, we will make sure everything is fair." The following spring, my grandfather developed a persistent cough that was eventually diagnosed as late-stage lung cancer. Despite never having smoked, the disease progressed rapidly, and within months, his robust frame had withered. I took extended leave from work to help my grandmother care for him, spending many nights in their guest room to provide support. During those difficult days, my sister rarely visited, always citing law school commitments. She did, however, call frequently. I noticed these calls often came when I was out running errands, and they typically ended abruptly when I returned to the house. More surprisingly, my parents suddenly became regular fixtures at the mansion, often arriving with documents for my grandfather to review during his increasingly rare lucid moments. My grandmother would firmly intercept these attempts, insisting he needed rest, not paperwork. In his final weeks, my grandfather had several private conversations with me during moments of clarity. "The company is solid," he told me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust the management team we have built, but always verify their work. And watch out for Marcus in accounting. Brilliant with numbers, but needs constant supervision." He passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning with my grandmother and me holding his hands. My parents and sister arrived 2 hours after being notified, just in time to meet with the funeral director. As arrangements were being discussed, I overheard my mother asking my grandmother about accessing accounts to help with expenses, despite my grandfather's explicit arrangements for his service being well documented. At the funeral, business associates and friends from across the country came to pay respects to a man known for his integrity and vision. Several pulled me aside to share stories of his generosity and express confidence in my ability to carry on the Brooks legacy. These comments drew tight smiles from my parents, who hovered nearby, steering certain key business contacts toward conversations with Stephanie instead. That evening, I discovered my grandmother sitting alone in my grandfather's study, tears silently tracking down her face as she held their wedding photo. "They are already circling," she whispered when I sat beside her. "Your parents. I can feel it." The year following my grandfather's death was both painful and illuminating. I resumed my full-time position, but visited my grandmother several times weekly. Our Sunday business discussions continued now with an added dimension as she began explicitly teaching me about the structure of their holdings and introducing me to their attorney, financial advisors, and key business partners. I noticed a troubling pattern emerging. On days I typically did not visit my parents, and Stephanie would arrive with home-cooked meals and feigned concern. Twice, I arrived unexpectedly to find them huddled with my grandmother over financial documents that were quickly shuffled away when I entered. "Just helping your grandmother organize some things," my father would explain smoothly. "No need to interrupt your busy career." One evening after they departed, my grandmother beckoned me to sit beside her on the terrace overlooking the lake. "Your parents have been suggesting I simplify my affairs," she said carefully. "They believe your sister should be the executor since she has legal training. They also think the business should be sold rather than passed down, claiming it would be too much pressure on you." Her blue eyes, still sharp despite her 84 years, held mine steadily. "They do not understand what Warren and I built. It was never just about money." Over the following months, my grandmother had several lengthy meetings with attorneys that she did not discuss with me. I respected her privacy, focusing instead on making her remaining years comfortable and meaningful. We traveled to her favorite botanical gardens, attended symphony performances, and I arranged for old friends to visit regularly. During a quiet moment on her birthday, she took my hand and made me promise something unusual. "When the time comes," she said, "remember that appearances can be deceiving, and Warren and I always played the long game. Promise me you will not lose faith, no matter how things may initially appear." Confused, but trusting, I promised. 3 months later, my grandmother suffered a severe stroke. For 2 weeks, I barely left her hospital room, sleeping in a chair while monitoring her care. My parents and Stephanie visited briefly each evening, often spending more time questioning doctors about prognosis than actually sitting with her. During a rare moment of lucidity, my grandmother motioned me closer to her bed. Her speech was slurred but understandable. "Remember your promise," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Trust the plan, and know how much Warren and I always loved you." She passed away peacefully that night. Unlike the raw, shocking grief of my grandfather's death, this loss settled into me with a deep, hollow ache. More surprisingly, my parents suddenly became regular fixtures at the mansion, often arriving with documents for my grandfather to review during his increasingly rare lucid moments. My grandmother would firmly intercept these attempts, insisting he needed rest, not paperwork. In his final weeks, my grandfather had several private conversations with me during moments of clarity. "The company is solid," he told me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Given her legal background, she will naturally take point on all this." When I mentioned that I might want some time to grieve before diving into estate matters, my father got on the line. "Alonzo," he said, "with forced patience, these things need to be handled efficiently. Besides, you should not expect too much involvement. Your grandparents were always fair people who valued family equality. Something in his tone triggered a memory of my grandmother's cryptic words, and I agreed to attend the meeting scheduled for the following week. The atmosphere in the attorney's wood-paneled office was thick with anticipation as we gathered 30 days after my grandmother's funeral. Mr. Patterson, my grandparents' attorney of over 40 years, sat behind an imposing desk, his expression carefully neutral as he arranged documents before him. My parents sat together on one side of the long conference table with Stephanie beside them in a crisp black suit that screamed newly minted lawyer. They had arrived early and were already comfortably settled when I walked in. My mother had brought a notepad and was jotting things down, while my father scrolled through his phone with the casual confidence of someone who already knows the outcome. "You made it," my mother remarked when I entered, as though my attendance was optional rather than essential. "Sit down, bro," Stephanie added with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Let us get this done so we can all move forward." As I took my seat opposite them, my father reached over to pat Stephanie's hand reassuringly. "It will be fine, sweetheart. Your grandparents always wanted what was best for the family." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat, drawing our attention. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. I had met him several times during visits with my grandparents, but never in this formal capacity. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. "As the executor of Warren and Eleanor Brooks's estate, I am here to carry out their final wishes as documented in their will and associated trusts." He began with standard procedures confirming our identities and explaining the legally binding nature of the proceedings. My father nodded impatiently, clearly wanting to get to the substantive portions. As Mr. Patterson began reading through initial bequests, personal items, charitable donations, provisions for longtime staff, I noticed my mother's smile growing increasingly confident. Stephanie sat up straighter occasionally, jotting notes on her legal pad. "Now, regarding the primary assets of the estate, including Brooks Development Company, associated real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets." My father leaned forward slightly, and Stephanie crossed her legs, a gesture of readiness I had seen her practice during mock trials. "They believe your sister should be the executor since she has legal training. They also think the business should be sold rather than passed down, claiming it would be too much pressure on you." Her blue eyes, still sharp despite her 84 years, held mine steadily. "They do not understand what Warren and I built. It was never just about money." Over the following months, my grandmother had several lengthy meetings with attorneys that she did not discuss with me. Patterson removed his glasses, his expression hardening slightly. "Mrs. Taylor, I must ask that you allow me to complete the reading without interruption. All relevant facts will be addressed." My father shifted uncomfortably as the attorney continued. "As I was saying, these assets are to be transferred to the Brooks Family Trust, with Alonzo Taylor named as primary beneficiary and trustee effective immediately." The room went silent for 3 heartbeats before erupting. "That cannot possibly be right," my mother exclaimed, her face flushing with anger. "There must be some mistake," my father added, standing up. "Eleanor specifically told us—" "If you will allow me to continue, Mr. Scrame," Patterson said firmly, "the document includes an explanatory section that addresses your concerns." He pulled out a separate folder, this one marked with a red tab. Warren and Eleanor Brooks added this addendum 6 months before Eleanor's passing. It states, and I quote, "We feel it necessary to document that our daughter and son-in-law, Margaret and Richard Taylor, have made multiple attempts to influence our estate decisions in favor of our granddaughter Stephanie. These attempts have included suggesting that Alonzo is financially irresponsible, lacks business acumen, and would squander our legacy. They have also claimed that Stephanie was promised significant assets, which is categorically false." My stomach dropped as the attorney continued reading. The addendum detailed specific dates and conversations where my parents had tried to manipulate my grandparents into changing their will. It mentioned concerning behavior following my grandfather's death, including attempts to have my grandmother sign documents while medicated. Most devastating was the revelation that my parents had orchestrated a financial emergency for Stephanie during law school, specifically to extract funds from my grandparents' money that had actually been used toward a vacation property in my parents' names. "This is slander, my mother," shouted her composure, completely abandoned. "We would never. We have signed affidavits from Martha Hopkins, your parents' housekeeper, and from nurse practitioner Jamal Williams documenting some of these attempts," Mr. Patterson said calmly. Additionally, Eleanor Brooks kept meticulous records of all conversations on this matter. He then reached for a remote control and turned toward the large screen on the office wall. "Your grandparents also recorded this video statement 6 months before Warren's passing. They asked that it be shown at this meeting." The screen flickered to life, revealing my grandparents sitting together in their study. My grandfather, already thin from his illness, but still commanding respect, spoke first. "If you are watching this, then Eleanor and I have both passed on. We have built our company and our fortune through hard work, integrity, and following our intuition about people. That same intuition has served us well in family matters." My grandmother continued, her voice steady. "We have watched with great disappointment the attempts to manipulate our estate decisions. We have witnessed the favoritism shown to one grandchild at the expense of another, and we have seen the true character of each family member revealed through their actions, not their words." They went on to explain their decision in detail, citing specific examples of my dedication to their values, contrasted with my sisters' and parents' focus on financial gain without regard for the business itself. They spoke of private conversations where my parents had discussed selling the company immediately after inheritance to cash out. "Alonzo has demonstrated the values upon which we built our legacy," my grandfather concluded. "He has earned this inheritance not by manipulation, but by embodying the principles we hold dear." As the video ended, Stephanie's shock had transformed into indignation. "This is completely unfair. I worked so hard in law school while he was out there with all their connections handed to him on a silver platter." Mr. Patterson waited for the outburst to subside before continuing. "The Brooks Family Trust has specific conditions. While Alonzo receives controlling interest in all business entities and the majority of financial assets, there are provisions for both of you, Margaret and Richard, as well as for Stephanie. These provisions, it turned out, were modest, monthly stipends contingent on non-interference with business operations and refraining from legal challenges to the will. Any litigation would result in immediate termination of all benefits." "This is extortion," my father sputtered. "You cannot legally, I assure you, Mr. Taylor. Everything has been structured with impeccable legal precision," Mr. Patterson replied. Miss Brooks supervised these arrangements herself, with input from 3 independent estate attorneys. "Should you wish to challenge the will, you are certainly entitled to do so, but I must advise you that there is comprehensive documentation supporting the testator's mental competence and free will in these decisions." The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur of legal terminology and unconcealed hostility. As Mr. Patterson outlined my new responsibilities as trustee, my family's expressions shifted from shock to cold fury. When the attorney finally closed his folders, signaling the end of the reading, my sister stood abruptly. "You planned this all along," she hissed at me. "You manipulated them for years, playing the devoted grandson, while plotting to take everything." "Stephanie, I had no idea." "Save it," my father interrupted, gathering his coat. "This family discussion is far from over." As they stormed toward the door, my mother turned back, her face contorted with anger. "Your grandparents were clearly not in their right minds at the end. We will not let this stand." The heavy door slammed behind them, leaving me alone with Mr. Patterson and the echoing weight of my unexpected inheritance. The weeks following the will reading were among the most difficult of my life. My phone buzzed constantly with accusatory texts from Stephanie, each more vitriolic than the last. You must be so proud of yourself, fooling two senile old people into giving you everything. Read one. Hope you enjoy your stolen inheritance while your sister struggles with student loans. You should be paying, declared another. My parents launched a dual strategy of icy silence, punctuated by occasional plaintive messages suggesting we work something out as a family. These inevitably led to proposals that I voluntarily sign over substantial assets to Stephanie to honor what your grandparents really wanted. I found myself in the surreal position of grieving my grandparents while simultaneously assuming control of their substantial business interests and defending myself against family attacks. Sleep became elusive, and I lost 12 pounds in the first month. A turning point came during my initial meeting with the trust administrators and the Brooks Development Executive Team. The company's CFO, Sandra Winters, handed me a sealed envelope after the formal introductions. Your grandmother asked me to give you this once everything was official, she explained. She said, you might need it when doubts crept in. Alone in my grandparents' former office, now technically mine, I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandmother. Dearest Alonzo, it began, if you are reading this, then the will has been read and the storm has begun. First, know that your grandfather and I made these decisions with complete clarity of mind and purpose. We were not manipulated, confused, or pressured. The letter went on to explain that they had first noticed my parents' pattern of favoritism when I was still in elementary school. They had watched with growing concern as my accomplishments were minimized while Stephanie's were celebrated extravagantly. They described specific incidents I had long forgotten: award ceremonies my parents skipped, achievements dismissed as luck rather than effort. We considered dividing our estate equally, my grandmother wrote, until we witnessed the extent of the manipulation. The final decision came after your grandfather's diagnosis, when your parents brought papers for him to sign, while heavily medicated papers that would have transferred majority control to them for safekeeping. Martha interrupted and called me immediately. The letter ended with words that finally broke the dam of emotions I had been holding back. You were loved for yourself, Alonzo, not for what you could do for us. Your grandfather and I see in you the same values we tried to live by: integrity, compassion, and the understanding that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. Honor our legacy, not by clinging to what we built, but by building something meaningful yourself. We trust you completely. All our love, Grandma Eleanor. That letter became my touchstone in the difficult months that followed. I kept it in my desk drawer, rereading it whenever the weight of family estrangement and new responsibilities became overwhelming. I threw myself into understanding every aspect of the business, working closely with the experienced team my grandparents had assembled. Rather than making dramatic changes, I spent the first 6 months listening and learning, earning the respect of employees who had been initially skeptical of the grandkid boss. My parents' attempts at reconciliation grew more transparent with time. My father arranged a casual lunch that turned into an hour-long presentation of why Stephanie deserved a position on the company board. My mother cornered me at a community event to suggest that my grandparents would have wanted me to purchase her a vacation home identical to one they had owned. These interactions were painful but clarifying. Each manipulative attempt strengthened my resolve to honor my grandparents' wishes rather than cave to family pressure. An unexpected ally emerged in my cousin Drake, who called one evening completely out of the blue. The letter ended with words that finally broke the dam of emotions I had been holding back. You were loved for yourself, Alonzo, not for what you could do for us. Your grandfather and I see in you the same values we tried to live by: integrity, compassion, and the understanding that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. Honor our legacy, not by clinging to what we built, but by building something meaningful yourself. We trust you completely. All our love, Grandma Eleanor. He proceeded to tell me about a similar situation with his father and my parents years ago involving a much smaller inheritance from a great-aunt. The pattern was identical manipulation favoritism, attempts to redirect assets. They did the same to my dad, but he did not have the protection your grandparents created for you, Drake explained. He lost everything in legal fees fighting them. That is why he moved across the country and barely keeps in touch. This conversation was both disturbing and liberating. The knowledge that my parents' behavior was part of a long-standing pattern helped me see that their actions reflected their own character flaws rather than any failing on my part. With this clarity, I made the difficult decision to establish firm boundaries. I communicated through Mr. Patterson that I would maintain the stipends established in the trust, but would not entertain further discussions about redistributing assets. I made it clear that any legal challenge would trigger the contingency clauses my grandparents had established. Stephanie filed a lawsuit anyway, which was promptly dismissed by the court after Mr. A.G. Patterson presented the extensive documentation my grandparents had assembled. The judge's comments about overwhelming evidence of testamentary capacity and clear intent closed that avenue permanently, though it cost Stephanie her stipend, as specified in the trust conditions. As the one-year anniversary of my grandmother's passing approached, I had established a new normal. The business was thriving under the continued guidance of its experienced management team, with my own growing contributions being increasingly recognized. I had moved into a comfortable but modest downtown condo, preferring to maintain my grandparents' home as a future company retreat center rather than living there myself. Therapy had helped me process both my grief and the family trauma. My circle of friends had shifted, with some unable to handle the rich friend dynamic and others proving themselves truly concerned with my well-being, regardless of financial status. I had even started dating again cautiously. The most meaningful project, however, was the Eleanor and Warren Brooks Foundation for Educational Opportunity, which I established to provide mentorship and college funding for students interested in ethical business practices. The foundation's first class of scholars had just been selected, and watching these bright young people begin their journeys brought me a sense of purpose that went far beyond material success. I encountered Stephanie unexpectedly at a charity gala in the fall. She had taken a position with a corporate law firm and was representing them at the event. Our interaction was brief and frosty. "Nice tax write-off," she commented, gesturing toward the foundation's prominent display. "Grandma and Grandpa would be so impressed with how you are spending their money." Rather than engaging with her bitterness, I simply said, "I hope you are finding fulfillment in your work, Stephanie," and moved on to greet other attendees. 2 months later, my parents requested a meeting. Cautiously, I agreed to see them at a neutral location, a private room at a downtown restaurant. They arrived looking older, somehow the strain of the past year evident in new lines around their eyes. "We have been doing some thinking," my father began after awkward initial pleasantries. "This situation has torn the family apart, and we want to find a way forward." What followed was not exactly an apology. There was no direct acknowledgement of their manipulative behavior, but rather a series of carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and different perspectives. "We were only trying to ensure everyone was treated fairly," my mother insisted. "Your grandparents did not always see the full picture of our family dynamics." I listened without interrupting, noting how their version of events still cast them as well-intentioned parents rather than the calculated manipulators documented in my grandparents' records. When they finished, I responded carefully. "I appreciate you reaching out. I have no desire for permanent estrangement. However, moving forward requires honesty about what happened. The trust arrangements will remain as my grandparents intended, and I will not be revisiting those decisions." Their disappointment was visible but contained. As we parted with stilted hugs, I realized that I had reached a place of forgiveness without reconciliation, understanding their flawed humanity without allowing it to dictate my choices or damage my self-worth. Driving home that evening, I took a detour past the lakeside property where my grandparents had lived. The lights were on in the main house, now occupied by the foundation's administrative offices. The boathouse, where my grandfather had taught me to build model ships, had been converted into a meeting space for mentorship sessions. I parked at the end of the dock and sat watching moonlight dance across the water. The inheritance had never really been about money or property. My grandparents had given me something far more valuable: the confidence to stand firm in my values, and the wisdom to recognize that family relationships should be built on love and respect, not manipulation and control. Their greatest legacy wasn't the business empire they built, but the lesson that true wealth lies in knowing your own worth, independent of others' validation. As I sat there in the peaceful darkness, I felt their presence not as a weight of expectation, but as a foundation of unconditional love that could never be taken away, the most valuable inheritance of all. Have you ever had to make difficult decisions about family relationships when money or inheritance came into play? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life family stories, and share with someone who might need to hear that standing your ground against manipulation is sometimes the most loving choice you can make for yourself and others. Thank you for listening, and remember that your worth is never determined by others' treatment of you, but by the values you choose to embody every day.